My name is Laura Perez. I'm the chair of the Latinx Research Center of the University of California, Berkeley, and we are happy to welcome you to session 1 of Afro Mexicanidad, a symposium. This morning's session will run from 11 a.m. to 12:30 Pacific Standard Time, and will return for this afternoon session from 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I want to next welcome my colleague, filmmaker and Professor Ray Tellez, who will introduce today's panelist and moderator. But before I do that, I want to give a special thanks to all those who have put this program together and made it possible. Again, special thanks to Professor Tellez, who was the key organizer of this important event, to Daniel Marquez, Abraham Ramirez, Frida Torres, Jose Aguilar, who worked to bring this event to you today. And thanks as well to today's translators, Angela Zawadowski, and Monica Incierte. Today's symposium would not be possible without the generosity and enthusiasm of our UC Berkeley campus co-sponsors, the Departments of African American and African Diasporic Studies, Art History, the Chicanx and Latinx Studies Program, Ethnic Studies, Spanish and Portuguese, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and the following research centers: the Arts Research Center, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Institute for the Study of Social Issues, and the Townsend Center for the Humanities. Warm thanks to you all. It is our great pleasure to welcome our honored guests and each of you today. Thank you for joining us. Professor Tellez.
Good morning to everyone. Buenos días a todos. Quiero dar las gracias al equipo en el LRC.
I want to thank the group in LRC. Thank you to the entire team. This program it's been a year in its planning, and it's an idea that we have, but we didn't know how to develop it. The first people I spoke about was Tiana. If you're serious, you need to include Emiko Saldivar and Monica Moreno Figueroa. If not, we are here.
This idea was first conceived about a year ago, and one of the first people that I spoke to was Professor Tiana Paschal. And she said, if you're serious about doing a panel on Afro-Mexicanidad, you've got to include Emiko Saldivar Tanaka and Monica Moreno Figueroa. And so we did get a very early commitment from both of you. Thank you very much. And then then invited Juliana Acevedo, who was doing tremendous work, and also introduced us to Hugo Arellanes Antonio, who is the photographer who we're going to see this afternoon. So I welcome you all. I welcome all of you who are joining us. I think we're in for a very, very exciting and illuminating panel. So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Tiana Paschal. Thank you.
Gracias, Ray, y gracias a Laura.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you to Laura for the invitation to be the moderator of this important panel. It's something that touches me deeply, because when I started my studies about negritude in Latin America, it was through the Afro-Mexican experience. I was taking a class in UCLA with Gomez Quiñones, and he wanted me to do a project involving corridos and the Afro-Mexican experience, and I did that as a part of my master's. So hello to everybody. My name is Tiana Paschal, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this panel. Two dear friends, people whom I very much respect, and a third person whom I just met, but their work is far, because it is very important. I admire the work that they do very much. So I'm going to present briefly the three dear panelists, and then we're going to get started on this conversation that's very important and very interesting. Afro Mexicanness and racism in Mexico. We first have Monica Moreno Figueroa, who is a friend, somebody I respect very much. She is a Black mestiza woman, associate professor in sociology, and has received a scholarship in social sciences in Downey College in Cambridge. She is one of the directors of the work group Decolonizing the Field, and Ella McPherson, who directs the project in Everyday Racism, which also needs a platform on the internet in order to give information and monitor racism in superior education. Since 2017 to 2021, she was the champion of issues of racial equality in Cambridge, and her research has been centered in intersectional experiences that are lived in racism in Mexico and Latin America, anti-racism and academic activism, feminist activism, and the connection between racism and these different things. Professor Morena Figueroa has been recognized for her pedagogy, and she's been a pioneer in education as a way to lead to social change. From 2010, with Dr. Enrico Saldívar, she has directed an organization that is a collective for the indemnity of racism in Mexico, cooperates to make racism a public discussion. It's also a pleasure to present Emiko Saldívar Tanaka, with whom I have shared a lot in this battle and personally. Professor Saldívar Tanaka studied sociology in the UNAM in Moscow and in New York. Her research has been centered in racial relationships, ethnic relationships in Mexico and Latin America, with an emphasis on relationships between the state and indigenous and Afro populations. From 2010, with Dr. Figueroa, she has been directing Coopera, which is dedicated to make racism a public subject. She is currently in the project Etnia y Raza, Ethnics and Racism and Race. She's been a professor in the Ibero-American University and CSS in Mexico City. And she is a professor in the departments of anthropology, and she studied Chicanos in the University of California, Santa Barbara. Among her publications, there is a book called Prácticas Cotidianas del Estado, an ethnography of indigenous in Mexico from 2008. And finally, I would like to present attorney Juliana Acevedo, who is an Afro-Mexican woman from the Costa Chica of Oaxaca, and she has been involved in activism in the Afro-Mexican population from 1997. She's worked with Coopera and with many other institutions and organizations that grassroots that have made the demands that have taken to inclusion of Afro-descendant communities in 2020 in Mexico. More recently, she formed the organization to foment equity of gender and respect for human rights in Mexican Afro communities. She's also the author of a report, 120 pages on Afro-Mexican communities, a report that was destined to the Supreme Court of Justice in Mexico. And currently she's working on another report and book about women and race with in the Electoral Institute of Mexico. Welcome to our three presenters, panelists, and dear friends. I would like to point out to everybody that we do have a translation, interpretation, which you can plug into, you have to go down below on your screen and choose the language where you are most comfortable. We have Spanish and English. If you'd like to hear the panel in Spanish, then stay where you are. And if not, press English underneath. Thank you to everybody for being here with us. We would like to start with a brief presentation by the panelists. I would like you to talk a little bit about your experience and work and how you have gotten to this panel. I would like to start with Monica.
Juliana.
Discúlpeme, qué
I'm
pena.
sorry.
Con Juliana,
Yes,
por
with Juliana, please.
Hola, muy
Hi.
buenas tardes a
Good
todas.
afternoon to everybody who is present in this virtual room and those of you who are following us on media. I thank you for this invitation to be part of this Afro-Mexican Symposium. I am honored to be sharing this panel with these two women, and now a third woman whom I admire very much. And I'd like to also say thank you to Monica and Miko for your support that you've always given me, and your support, which I really appreciate. It's a painful subject. It burns. I'm going to start with a poem that shows injustices that have been suffered by my ancestors. But to be quiet is not something that I can do. Today, my words go up to the memory and to address those who have suffered from slavery, which was justified by those who benefited from it and their complicity. That's where the bad comes, that is in the structure, and there is no cure for it at this point, because my chances for having a free, dignified life decreases. How did I come to this panel? Well, when I was just a child in the 90s, I got involved in activities in the Casa de mi Pueblo, the home of the people. I was my elementary teacher and president of the organization Africa Hace Israel Reyes. It's an organization that has coordinated with Purpura organization and Multicultural organization of the UNAM. All these organizations got together. We've had different activities to recognize the rights of Black or Afro-Mexican people, to be recognized in the Constitution of this country and to be recognized in statistics. And these demands started in 2007, and I'll talk about this in the next forum. To go back a little bit in my memory, racism and racial discrimination have pushed me to want to know more about who I am and where I've come from. Why? Coming out of my community and my phenotypical characteristics, like the color of my skin and my curly hair, was admired by some, and by others it was something that was repugnant, which made them act offensively against me. My bad experiences have been many, and even though some funny ones can be included that have to do with ignorance about Afro-Mexican community in the country, this is not something that stops being painful because of that. And it marked my adolescence and youth, and it made it important to try to find my roots. And I have started discovering my roots as I've continued in this process. Not all of them. My ancestral story will continue being something that I continue finding out about, because this history is lost at my great-grandmother. To want to know more about my lineage with more precision is something that won't be possible. And I can assure you that it's not just my case, but it is also the case of most Afro-Mexicans. One of the exceptions might be the Black population mascota. In Guerrero, in order to be able to fill out these lacunae in our knowing, there are myths that have been founded. For example, that Afro-Mexicans came to these states in a boat that actually went down. And it's worth mentioning that even when there are different studies about the Black or Afro-Mexican descendants that have been done since the 40s, there still isn't an official story that contributes to make or reinforce our identity as Afro-Mexican people. Advances in that sense have been very few and almost none, even though this is one of the most important reiterated demands of those who are within the movement. As time passed, I have seen more clearly inequalities in which these communities have found themselves because of racism in the structures in our territories. And that is why I continue fighting and I continue looking for a just life for Afro-Mexicans. To unite is something new, and this is the right of women, Afro-Mexican women. With my niece Lupita, we created a collective called OFNA, which is it was mentioned at the beginning. And there we have made alliances with many valuable women who form the network in Latin America and the Caribbean, many other women and allies. I can't mention names because I don't want to leave any out. And so this is how we have, with these interventions that I have been able to do through this time, and with this stream of trying to change the realities that hurt our human realities generated by structural racism. And that is why, that's what's brought me to this symposium, to be a part of these interventions, to try to do the best I can to let you know who we are and how we are. Thank you very much. Thank you, Juliana, and welcome. Monica, please. Thank you. Thanks for this invitation, for your infinite patience, for all her work, and I'm very happy to be here with my friends and colleagues and Juliana. I'm very happy that we have this panel, and this title, Afro-Mexican, is important, because to be in a panel that has this title it shows a success in our organization and the success of many debates we've had. And it's one moment on the path. The debate about the name continues. It's a debate for what's Black, what's Afro-Indian, what's Mestizo Afro, the Afro-Mexican, and body, culture. We're in this process. We're in process, and it's still in flow, and it's still being defined. For you to be able to localize a little bit from where I'm speaking, I am a woman who has demanded, who can now demand with better clarity and assurance, my Mexican identity, my Black identity, mostly because there's a codified body marked as Black, read as the other, by the other, as different, and also very marked by the experience of racism that has molded and oriented my life. Unfortunately, it's not an experience that comes from being part of a community that's Black and having grown in a space or with a cultural reference that is Afro. However, I have arrived at this place where I can share and understand many and join from a place where I grew in a mestizo context in Mexico, not with a lot of Blacks in my childhood as I was growing up. At the same time, I'm a woman who is mestiza, middle class, lesbian, fat, academic, activist, and a migrant. And from there, I have been organizing my perspective and my work. I am here because I'm interested in racism, in this form of oppression. First, from an academic research standpoint, and then from there, I have reformulated and turning around to see what my personal experience has been and to position myself politically. And from there, I have understood what's happened to me, what my past has been like, my life. How did I get to this point? And so, more than in the other direction, it's been a process that, well, from academia, I've been able to understand. And this has to do with the context in Mexico, where it isn't spoken, or it wasn't spoken about in a concrete, explicit, critical way. This issue of racism, it's all been a sort of battle to make this possible, as many of us in my generation before, we grew up with this sense that there was something, but we didn't know what. We didn't have a language to be able to say it. My investigation is mostly about the circulation and functioning of racism. I started by observing and empirically studying mestiza women in Mexico to understand the context in which they live in a negation of racism and at the same time an ambivalence about how to move in privileged spaces and disadvantaged spaces, which is very particular for the Mexican context, and both very oppressive spaces, theirs and the others, as they're called. And from that point, I've been interested in studying mestizaje as this project, Mexican racial project, which is important to understand how racism works in Mexico and in Latin America. And to be able to understand the logic that organizes daily life, which is very different from the American context. Well, I don't know if it's very different, but I think that the immigrant experience has some interesting mixtures. There, it is very particular. Racism in Mexico isn't something that's imported from the United States. It has its own story and logic built around it. When I try to get closer to it, as I have done more recently, to sort of approach the population, Black population in Mexico, I've been trying to capture this contradiction of being Black in a country of mixed mestizo people, and to think about how this works. How does this contradiction work? Where supposedly we're all mixed, we're all welcome to this national project, but not really, and some more than others, and some even less. I think this is sort of what I could say, what I could contribute at this point. Thank you.
Gracias, Mónica. Émico.
Bueno, antes de que sigamos, una práctica que hemos desarrollado en nuestras
Before we continue, one of the things that we've done in our interventions, our activities, is that as a way to kind of liberate language, when we know there is translation and there are people who don't speak the language that is being spoken, we take 1 minute of silence. And this isn't a minute to look at your computer or your text, or no, this is a minute where you can sort of close your eyes, rest, let your mind rest from all this effort that we're making to translate things. So let's start with this minute.
Ya. Ya se cumplió. Gracias. Para mí fue muy bueno
Thank
porque
you.
me ayudó a pensar un poco. Qué
It
bueno.
helped me think a little
Bueno,
bit.
yo soy Emiko Saldívar.
I am Emiko
Yo
Saldívar.
soy mestiza
I
japonesa.
am a mestiza
Mi padre es
Japanese
mexicano y mi
woman. My
madre
father is
es
Mexican, my
mexicana.
mother is
De
Japanese,
hecho,
and
nací
I was
en
born,
México. Mi
well,
mamá
I
nació
wasn't born in
en
Mexico. I
una
went
pequeña
there
aldea.
when I was 2.
Pero crecí todo el resto de mi vida en
But the
Ciudad de
rest of the
México.
time I was in
Hasta que
Mexico City
emigré. Ahora
until
ya
I
soy migrante
emigrated.
también de
I'm
vuelta
now an immigrant
en Estados Unidos
in the
desde
United
hace
States
10 años. Entonces supongo que ya me
as
puedo
of 10
considerar
years ago. So
migrante.
I suppose now I can
Antes
consider
decía
myself
vengo de
immigrant.
paso, pero supongo
Before I
que
said I was just
todos
passing, but I guess that's what
los
happens to all of
venimos,
us
venimos de paso.
immigrants. We think we're just coming to
Bueno,
temporarily.
¿cómo llego yo a este
How
tema?
did I come to
Bueno, a
this?
mí mi interés, yo empecé, de hecho,
Well,
digamos, ahora que usan la palabra walk,
now that
mi
we
momento
use
de
the
despertarme
walk,
fue cuando fue el levantamiento zapatista.
it was in the
Digamos
Zapatista movement.
que me, digamos, me inició en
That's
esta
when
idea.
I sort of
Ya, perdón.
got started
Que en el levantamiento zapatista en 1994,
in 94.
de hecho yo ya estaba estudiando en
During the
Estados Unidos
Zapatista movement, I
y
was
fui a
already
estar en Nueva
studying,
York,
or
mi
when the
familia,
Zapatistas
y
began, I was already in the United
me
States
llamó muchísimo,
visiting my
muchísimo
family, and
la
I was
atención
very
que
interested
no importaba
in the
el
fact that
lugar
it didn't matter
ideológico en el que estuviera,
what the ideological place where you
la
was,
reacción hacia que
the
un estudiante
reaction
se haya
towards the
levantado
fact
y
that
demás,
indigenous people
fue
had
parecida, era la misma.
taken
Podía
up
ser de
arms was
izquierda
the
o de
same,
derecha. De la
left or
derecha no me
right.
sorprendió.
It didn't
Pero
matter.
yo
On
venía
the right, it
de
didn't
familia de
matter, but
izquierda
I
y
came from a
entonces
left
mucho gente que yo respetaba y confiaba en sus mentes
family, and I
en cómo
trusted them and
pensaban sobre la
their
realidad
minds and
social
how
de
they thought
México.
about the Mexican
Estaba
social reality.
totalmente, digamos,
I
conectados
was
con la idea de
completely,
que estaban siendo
we all overlapped
manipulados,
on the fact that
que
they
eran
were being manipulated,
anacrónicos,
that this was
bueno, primero era como
anachronic,
de indignación y después
archaic.
una
So there was a
especie
kind
de
of an
levantamiento.
indignant sense, like, who are these
Entonces
people who
ahí
are
para mí hubo
rising up? And so
primero
for me,
personal,
there was a
de
personal
cómo,
rupture.
porque no
How?
puede, o sea, para mí
Why?
era natural, era
For me, it was
lo
natural.
esperado,
I expected
simpatía hacia el
this, that
movimiento
there would be
indígena,
sympathy
pero
towards
la
an
reacción no.
indigenous movement, but that
Entonces,
wasn't what
fue
happened.
en ese momento que
So
empecé
at
a
that
tratar de
moment, I
entender
began to try to
el porqué
understand
de la reacción.
why
Entonces,
there
de
had been
ahí,
this
bueno,
reaction.
lo que va a ser después
So then
mi investigación y mi
that's where
interés
my
por
research took off, kind of with an
conocer y
interest
entender
to
a la población mestiza,
understand the
entender por
mestiza
qué
population, why
reaccionaron así,
they
por qué
reacted in that
reaccionaron
way,
en
or
ese
why
momento
did we react
sobre
like that? I mean, at
una
this
mujer
moment,
mestiza.
I consider myself a mestiza
Y
woman.
obviamente mi sensibilidad
And
está
obviously,
marcada por
my
el hecho de
sensibility is
totalmente
marked by the fact
mestiza
that I'm
y
not
por la
completely
experiencia de
mestiza
otredad
because I have experience
Entonces,
being
lo que
othered.
decidí es
So
estudiar
what
el
I decided
espacio
was to
donde
study the
se crea lo
space
mestizo, porque
where the
parte de lo
mestizo
mestizo se
reality is
conoció
created,
desde lo
or
dogmático,
identity is
lo dominante.
created. And one doesn't
Entonces, eso
mention
me
it.
llevó a estudiar al
It's
Instituto Nacional
not dominant. And so
Mexicanista,
that sent me to the
estudié
Instituto
investigación
Nacional
sobre
Indigenista,
población
Indigenous National
este,
Institute.
y escogí ese
And
espacio porque
I
era
chose
la
that space
frontera. Yo
because it
quería
was
ver
at the
cómo
border. I wanted to
se
see
construía lo
how
mestizo a
was the
partir de construir
mestizo
al otro,
reality
usando
constructed
totalmente la
from the
historia de
construction
Eduardo
of the
Said, el
other.
orientalismo, ¿no?
Using
Que
Eduardo
aprender
Said
no
and
es sobre el
Orientalism, who
oriente,
says that what
aprender
you learn
sobre el
isn't about the
escrito sobre el
or
oriente.
the East, but
Entonces, con eso en mente, hago una
what those
etnografía
who
del
write
Estado y
about
estudio esta
the other.
institución,
And so I
que su
studied
papel histórico fue
uh,
hacer
studied
dirigir las
this, and
políticas del Estado,
he
hacia la
was
población migrante.
directing
Mi principal
the
conclusión es que
institution's
hace
relations
poco
with the
los
indigenous
ecos
population. And what I
nacionalistas
realized is that this
para mejorar la
institute,
vida de los pueblos
did very
indígenas,
little to
pero
better
hace
the
mucho
life of
para
indigenous people,
legitimar
but
la
it does a
presencia de
lot
un
to
Estado
legitimize
mexicano
the
centralizado
Mexican
en
centralized
las
state,
vidas
which
de pueblos y regiones
enters
indígenas
into the
como el caso
lives
de
of people,
Chiapas,
indigenous
la
people,
Sierra
and
Tarahumara,
areas
lugares donde en
like
realidad
Chiapas or
en
the
muchos lugares
Tarahumara
la
area,
única
where
oficina legal
there
que
wasn't any
existía
other
era la
federal
oficina
office
del
except
Instituto
for this
Nacional
one,
Indigenista.
the
Entonces, digamos,
Indigenous
esa es mi
National
trayectoria,
Institute. So
que yo
INI
siempre,
for short.
yo digo
So
que
that's
Mónica
my
y yo trabajamos
trajectory. And so I say
conjuntamente
that
porque
Monica
ella
and I
estudia
sort of
más
work
como
well together very well, because
desesclavizada, ahora ya no,
she's
pero en
looking
aquel
at, I
tiempo
mean,
cuando
she
nosotros
did not now,
estudiamos,
but when we met,
ella hablaba de
she would
forma,
talk
digamos,
about
cotidiana, de cómo se vio
the
el
daily
resurgimiento
way
de
of
las ideas políticas
how did
afrodescentralistas.
racism work. And
También
I
desde
was
una
working
perspectiva
on this other from a more
institucional.
institutional point of view.
Y eso, bueno, a la
And
larga, una de mis
in the
mayores
long run, one of my
preocupaciones
greatest
u
worries
objetivos ha sido cómo
was how to talk about racism in Mexico in such a way that people would say, oh, yes, I know what you're talking about. Luckily, we've already gone past this step. Everyone's talking about racism. In the last 5 years, the whole panorama nationally has changed in terms of racism. And in all of these, in terms of this, I did lots of things. I went to study schools, wanted to see how schools reproduce racism. And from that point, we started working in urban sectors. How do you identify indigenous populations? It took me to statistics. Eduard Telles invited me to be part of this project, PERLA, Project for Ethnicity and Race in Latin America, which is this project that we shared. I'm sorry, I'm nervous. Thank you to everyone who invited me. I forgot to say, you don't have to be nervous, says Diana. Oh, I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm very excited to be here with you, Diana. And thank you, Ray, for giving us this chance, and Daniel for your patience with us. And I want this to be kind of a place where we can talk and talk, discuss with Juliana and Monica, whom I really care about a lot. And so anyway, Perla is like this was a chance to show that racism isn't an ethnographic anecdote. It's not because this is far away and so that's why the indigenous people are poorer. It's that the statistic data would permit us to see that this is a phenomenon that's being reproduced. It's like over and over. You add one plus one, it becomes a social phenomenon. And so this is how I came into it. I don't know about it. I never knew about statistics. I sort of trust that Eddie will help us. And in this process, I learn a lot about the importance of statistics, the importance that it has, data. And I found out, because of something that I noticed, was that indigenous organizations weren't that interested in this issue of statistics and this census. They weren't thinking of fighting anything around that. But on the other hand, Black organizations have been invited to talk with the census office in Mexico, the INEGI, to decide how the question is going to. In 2015, there was a national sort of demonstration with different questions, and then to be added in the 2020 census. And that is a very interesting process, unique. Like, what? They want to talk with these organizations? So that was what took me to this Costa Chica. And I invite Monica to come with me. Let's go, both of us. Well, we did. They went, this is in the past, by the way, the interpreter wants to correct. We went with Monica and to see what was going on there. And so I arrived not because I had a specific interest in the Black situation, but what I was interested in was how statistics are measured ethnically, racially in Mexico. That's what led me to this. And then from then there was a discussion that began with some tension, with a long history. I don't know if we'll touch upon it here, which has to do with how categories are used. There's a lot of resistance. This happened with Perla. Perla was rejected when we presented it, when we presented the results. In Mexico, it was very much questioned, our methodology in terms of skin color categories, mestizo, white, indigenous, Black. There was a lot of rejection of the use of these categories. So let's say that we could say that this rejection against Perla was also there when we were formulating the question of the census. So that is my story. Thank you for making us take a moment of silence, because this helped me too very much. Thank you. I would like each panelist to take maybe 7 minutes to talk about the context, the sociological context. Our, this is a theme that not everyone, I don't know if everybody knows about this directly, context in which this work is being done between. If you can take 7 minutes to talk about the context, about the work that you do, we can start with Monica. Well, something that's important in order to be able to understand the context, to talk about racism in Mexico, is on the one hand, to see that this project, this racial project, the way that racism works in Mexico is under this idea or experience, ideology, this discourse, I mean, lots of ways of describing it, mestizaje. Mestizaje joins lots of possible definitions. It was a historical moment, racial and cultural mixture that began with the conquest and colonization of Mexico. What's Mexico now? And Latin America. But it's also a series of other important facts, such as its official ideology, the way that the Mexican government, after the revolution, decided to organize how people can become Mexican. How does one become Mexican? It's a whitening project. It tells us what it should be organized. And so from our research, we've seen talk about how mestizaje, how to understand it, basically, in order to see how it's specifically different in Mexico, because it is an assimilation, not segregational movement or step, where the mix, the promise of inclusion, assimilation is kind of included. And so keeping this in mind, I would like to talk with you a little bit about what I've analyzed in terms of how the Blackness enters this discussion of mestizaje. In general, there's an idea in Mexico that Black people have been made invisible, erased from history. And thinking about this idea that's very prevalent, I had a lot of doubts. I first was thinking, well, how to understand that? If there's a presence of Blacks, how can we understand this theme of roots culturally, that there were Blacks and that somehow there's ramifications or signs of it, but also how to observe or place the Mexican obsession for skin color, veneration of whiteness, the resigned acceptance of what's brown, and a repugnance against what's brown or Black, just to put it in a provocative way. And so this made me, combined with the work from the Afro pessimists in the United States, mostly in the United States, to place what would happen, to think what would happen if we separated Black people from the idea of Blackness. And we start to see that this separation helps us understand and see that there is a mistreatment and a discrimination of Blacks in Mexico, and that the idea of Blackness is very present, that it's almost a central thing for the national imagination. And this allowed me to to argue that an important key that maintains mestizaje is in functioning, and therefore the national identity, is precisely anti-Black racism. And it's this combination and a continuous aversion to blackness, to what's blackest, to what's dark. This color, the skin color that sort of comes out and can't be controlled and is like what must be fought against, what must be bettered, improved, which is an idea, and it lives in the social cultural imagination daily of everybody in Mexico. And so when I talk about anti-Black racism, I'm not talking only about what the experience of Black people is, but how this experience shapes the experience of all Mexicans. And so to be Mexican is based on distancing yourself from what's Black. So when we talk about whitening, and perhaps it's very logical, but we don't think about it. It's as if my direction is towards whiteness, then what stays behind? If I turn, what's behind? What's Black? And what's most at the back? And this conjugation is interesting of the darkness, Blackness, indigenous, white, how this sort of plays together, and how the subject can move in a space where that Blackness doesn't allow. I think it's important to the anti-Black racism is central for mestizaje, for this racism, because it produces conditions of dishumanization and to the disadvantage of the Black population, but an advantage to non-Black populations. And this is key for mestizaje. To be called Black and to be treated as Black only makes sense in a space where other spaces, as mestizas, white, it's lived like that, and who occupy superior positions in the racial hierarchy in opposition and distance from what is Black. So the force of mestizaje, its nationalist force, requires there to be an anti-Black racism as an arbiter that regulates the attention of the entire population towards what's white. So it confuses things, because on the one hand, there's this idea that we need to be mixed, and everybody who's mixed is part of this nation, but we need to mix well, and we have to not be Black, and we have to avoid that. If you come out Black, because this is society, that you can get out. How did the baby get out? If you're Black, if you came out Black, you have a problem, and hopefully you'll be able to better the race. So anti-Black racism keeps us aligned.
Una pausita, discúlpeme, Mónica, gracias. Es que hay un problema con la interpretación.
There's a problem with the interpretation, I think. Thank you to Angela and Dasha for this difficult work.
I think that you are in the
you're
Spanish
on the
channel, and we need to
Spanish
go
channel,
to
you
the
have to
English
go to
channel.
the English
And
channel.
so whoever is
The person who's
interpreting right now, we
interpreting
have to
right
go
now
into the English.
is in
So
the
we are
wrong
in the wrong
channel.
channel. So right now it's okay.
I don't know if it's Angela or Dasha.
Yes,
Can you go to
we're
the
in the other channel. And so the interpretation is it's in the recording.
It to be correct.
Yes, everything is happening. So please go ahead. Anyway, we were talking about that. This is that what we're going to talking about racism. It's like an arbiter. It's like a referee. It's just a way of distracting in order to. The whole idea is to distract us from the way racism, and it has us in line, and it tells us the story of mestizas so that we don't pay attention to the racial situation. And in the meantime, we always notice that there is a racial topic. This is my 7 minutes are almost over. So I hope that it helps, because that when we're talking about the appearance of the struggle, organizations, Afro-Mexicans, from my point of view, we're facing this context when there is a denial of the population, and then there is, of course, the difficulty of dealing with dark people, and also there is a big push to uh, uh, discard identity in order to really give rise to equity, equality, and these things, because, and I hope that this anti-Black racism helps us understand right now. Thank you, Monica. Juliana's turn.
Antes de que vaya Juliana, podríamos tomar el minuto de silencio.
Could we take 1 minute of silence,
Que
please?
seguro las intérpretes lo necesitan. Después de lo que pasó. Un minuto de silencio. Recuerden, este es el minuto para
Remember, this is the silence to stop watching the screen and get up and just take this time.
Ahora sí, ya.
Okay.
Todo tuyo el micrófono, Tatiana.
Ok, gracias. Estaba gritando a mis niños, por eso que mi micrófono estaba así, pero muy bien. A Juliana, por favor.
Hola de nuevo.
Okay. Hello again.
Bueno, me toca dar el contexto histórico en la lucha.
I am going to talk about the historical context in the Afro-Mexican struggle, forgetting, denial, the whitening, the bleaching history, and they're the triggers, especially the movement of Black people started in the 90s and 97 in the month of March, but there is a history, and the history with the things that I talked about at the very beginning. The struggle was in the 90s was Renacer, and it was mostly based on culture, but during the struggle that came from that inequity and from the Afro-Mexican communities lived, and also to be able to answer to all this information that came into workshops and fora, and so we did it through Mexico, Nación Multicultural, multicultural nation. And Dr. Francisco Siga Gabriel mentioned it, that we went from just talking about it to action. So from 2007, this is where there's the big split. This is where things, the before and after. The first one, Polycarpi, the first of all, including or the inclusion in ELGI, which differentiates the Afro-Mexican community, of how many there are, who are we, and where are we. And those people who were involved in the movement, we said that there were like about 500,000, approximately 500,000. That's what we had, including it in textbooks, in history, and people who were brought as slaves as their descendants when the nation state was created. It was one of the demands because history plays a very important part and it's a very important role in the construction of society. And then also, and then people who have enough health, this medicine, this is another demand, and also consulting freedom, all kinds of actions that wants to be implemented in the various territories, and who lives in those various territories. So there are a lot of other demands. There were what we're requesting. They were demanding other things, but and the participants express it in their fora, but we are concentrating on three. First of all, the first things, excuse me, it's first of all, statistics, which allow us to identify the backwardness, the social and poverty, and also the indicators in public policies and actually filling the gap in this and lack of equality. This demands in terms, we find it in the Afro-Mexican Forum in July 2007 in Jose Maria Morelos, and this was one of the inclusions in that happened in 22 because we had Purpura Se, Africa Se. They wanted to align themselves with UNAM, of course, and we tried to bring it about a special test. Different variables were tested in the various localities like Costa Chica. The first week in July, the results of these tests were not given officially, but extra officially, because part of the person from INEGI said that they didn't understand the question. Therefore, we could not include it in the 2010 census. And so civil organizations decided then to do some pilot events with Costa Chica, and they're trying to measure it by including it as with a question in the census. So in 2012, we went back to working groups with INEGI and to find it with about Black peoples of Mexico. And this group called REC INEGI, we tried to identify the methodology to address the Black population. And this also contributed to what was realized, to what was done in 2011, and the Afro descendants did they actually proposed some names that could be identified to the population. And then we wanted to see if we could include some questions to it be included in the pilot test. And also proposals. One was names, actual ethnic names, and that would be ideal for the Black population, but they were not taken into consideration. And then afterwards, the 1.2% of the population identified itself as Afro-descendant. And to this results, we needed to add the fact that there were so many gaps that needed to be filled, that there were that it looked like we were doing better, or at the same time the national population, and and we really had to find a large number of peoples who had African population, so we could see the lack of equality. And these are things that are big. For instance, there were the chikungunya and dengue and other type of pandemics, which have not really been treated differently. In 2020, the census in 2020, UNAM also helped us, but there were there was a lot of opposition from the and civil organizations, the dialogue that we tried to have, but we wanted to have a good X-ray of our situation. And the results of 2020 census tells us that of all the millions Mexicans, 2% identify ourselves as Black, Afro descendants, and Afro Mexicans. And this is and more than 40 to 70% Afro. And this was provided by the collective, especially the African Mexican Afro collective, Teresa Marroquí. And they tell us that the average the non-unborn children is 2.1, and also now on the national level is also 2.1. But if we go to townships with African population, they tell us it's 2.9. And when we approach other people, they large numbers, they say 3.13. Illiterate people is 4.7. African descent, 5.3. But when we do studies with 6 to 40 to 70%, they tell us 70%. And those, they say, 13, 17, and some with the Afro population, more than 18%. Health-wise, one of the indicators that closes formal employment is the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social. It says that it's 49.30, but when we see townships that have more than 70, they say 4% only. Then we have to move to access to internet. The national average is 52.1%. In the national sphere, it says that Africans have, or Afro, we have over 53%. So we're doing better than the national numbers. But when we look at the 40, 70%, it actually tells us that it's actually 90%. And in those towns that have more than 70% of African descent, here I am. I'm here with the Wi-Fi under the tree because we have very little reception. So reality is very different from the facts that they give us or the data that are giving us. So they don't see the reality of various communities. We continue to struggle because there is a lot of inequity, a lot of disparity. So it does not reflect reality. Many of the people polled did not look at or answer the question because either they were embarrassed and because they said they asked by themselves if the person looked what they consider to be Afro. The results say that we're doing better, but that is not true when we look at reality. Constitutionally speaking, it's not what we had asked for, it's not what we expected. It was on a C, in a C label that was not really giving us the names. It doesn't talk about equality. It says, oh, here they are, they're talking about Afro Mexicans, and that they have the same rights as indigenous people. That's why we said that it's just a name only. It is hard to visualize the impact of the pandemic in the Mexican population because we don't see it like in other countries, like in Colombia, to mention a few, to see how Afro descendants have been affected by COVID. In Costa Chica, where I live, in Guerrero and Oaxaca, there is a study that has been done in conjunction with Santa Barbara, and a group of activist women, and we don't have the data to talk about this, but we talked with Dr. Rosarello, but some of the data says that the people who died all were suffering the conditions of COVID, and maybe they're not dying, but they are dying because of the lack of services. They don't have access to diagnosis. They don't have access to tracking and following up to their chronic situation. And they have like diabetes and older people, for instance, senior people. Somebody said they want to let old people die. Of course, they want to take consideration as everyone, measure everyone at the same. Some people cannot go to the places to places where the vaccine is being. We don't have a guarantee. We are not guaranteed health services, and we have seen it in this pandemic. Things are racialized. Some of the deaths that the Mexican state has, we have this historical debt, and we're not included in the official history. And of course, this is part of this latest acknowledgement, as well as statistics. I don't know if I am past. It doesn't matter. It's okay. It's okay. We're very honored to have you here. And I think I'm going to will be in the next block. So thank you very much, Juliana. You give us a lot of food for thought. We can see the urgency of this, and racism, the practice of racism, that we can see it through the space. It's not individual only, it's everywhere. Hi, amigo.
Muchas gracias y gracias, Juliana, por todos los datos y como que ya hablaste un poco de lo que.
Thank you, Juliana, for all the information you're giving us.
Yo le llamo activismo estadístico.
Okay, good. I want to talk a little bit about
así voy a como tratar de traer un poco lo que hemos hecho en Coopera, ¿no? En esta idea de crear un espacio.
The idea is to create to create a space. Most of us have been in academics, and there's also a way of looking at research and so that populations as such can add a layer of the racial layer to the work. And what we have done is that we talked about the importance of it, research, and it's really important for us that research is very, very important. Rigorous. And to also understand
es que es un tema que es muy complejo de hablar.
this is a
It's very
very
complicated
difficult
to
topic to
talk
talk
about this
about.
when we have mixed families where it's not clear that the others are over there, but it's the same family is there. It's difficult to talk about this. It's what Monica was saying. Mestizaje has affected all of us. So what we've done in Coopera is to try to create a methodology where we can try to have this space where we can see that emotional dimension of how racism, the racial mestizaje project has touched all of us. And once we understand that, it's much easier to start to erase this theme and understand where we are, where we can think well and where we can, and all of these complexities. So this is a reality of how we can, in the context of mestizaje in Mexico, it's also the strength. I mean, we can't start, we have to understand the complexity. Talking about racism in Mexico implies that it's complicated and it's not in one direction, but rather that it's much more elaborate. So it wasn't where I wanted to go. I wanted to start with that, but I started with that. Sometimes that's how things go.
Hablando del
Talking about
contexto,
context,
lo que Juliana mencionó.
Juliana talked about, and this is one of the things, urgencies that why it was urgent when Monica and I went. After we went the first time, we did some interviews. We talked with people who had participated in Tersensal, and we realized we saw what the discussion was like. We saw the long work that those organizations in Costa Chica had done to position it and to ask for this question in the census. The dates were worrying, and is the same thing, unfortunately, as what happens with the census. There isn't the disequality isn't reflected. If we see the dates, education levels are the same, that the slightly higher educational level. So all of this, and this involves the mixture of academia and mixture with academia, brings us to present the fact. Monica and I returned to Costa Chica. We were doing another kind of study about indigenous mestizas, Black women there, another subject. But we started to present the data, and we thought, well, there's a problem with the question. There's a problem because this question doesn't reflect racial inequality. And that took us it took me to create a project which is academic, but that has a activist social perspective. The idea is to bring all the actors who are involved in the process of this question. 2018, we did this a year before the question was defined for the 2020 census. A colleague and Erica Arenas and I, and Mr. Biafara, who's from Colombia, got together and we formed a team to talk about the inclusion of this question, what the problems are, and the importance of how that question is written and the kind of data that you're going to get from it. And in this process, and Juliana was very much part of this, we saw that a sort of tendency began to appear, attention to racial categories on the one hand, and on the other, a very mestiza vision of this identity question. Very official, very from this tradition about, not talking about race, or we've already gone beyond this theme, and this is an American theme. All of that comes from outside, and this is not a problem that involves us. So what was very interesting is that we started a dialogue between a qualitative sociologists, anthropologists, and on the other hand, those who do more data. And at that point, that it was clear that there were different positions about what should be the function of this question. And it's not that there's a right or wrong answer. It's just these were the things that were before us. On the one hand, for many people, this question, to include it in the census was necessary for the process of auto-affirmation from point of view of identity, self-determination of Black populations and descendants, Afro descendants. That was important, something the census must recognize, that there is a Black population. But on the other hand, there's this problem of how to measure disequality, inequality caused by racism. And so in this discussion, what we were saying was that it was important to not just have Black and Indigenous categories, but also a category which would be mestiza and white. In order to measure inequality, we have to take into account all the identities, not just the ones that have been historically dispossessed, but what happens with the flow of well-being and wealth. And that was rejected. But it wasn't a battle that was needed to take place within the Afro and Black organizations. But what Juliana is saying now is that the data from the census, if it's not read carefully, which is what they've done, try to look for other representations of the data, there could be a false perspective or view. And so I think if I or someone from the United Nations says, look, this is the money we have to support Afro-descendant populations in Latin America, let's see how that population is. Mexico resolved the problem. Its Afro-descendant population, according to the question, is fine, very well. So we have a problem, which takes us to this issue of representation and classification. Right? So if you ask me where I am, well, that's where we are having this conversation. On the one hand, we celebrate that we have attained these spaces. There's mobilization that's very important, visibility. I don't know if visibility, but there's more of a presence, more positioning of this Black and Afro-descendant issue. But on the other hand, the worry is what happens with this issue of racial inequality, and how is this affecting Black and Afro-Mexican and Afro-descendant populations in Mexico? And this continues to be sort of in process. So let's take a minute of silence. And then you can tell us how we continue. Okay? Here's a minute. Rest your eyes, get up.
Ya fue el minuto.
Okay, that was a minute.
Gracias, Emiko.
Thank you, Emiko.
Nos queda 15 minutos nada más, y me gustaría involucrar
We have
al
15 minutes left, and I would like to include the
voy a hacer
public.
una preguntita
I'm going to ask
y luego voy a leer
something, and then I'm going to read some of the questions that we
en el
have
Q&A.
here in the
Me
Q&A.
gustaría que las
And I'd like the panelists
escogen,
to choose
cuál pregunta quieren
which question they would like
contestar.
to address.
Hacemos una ronda,
We'll
y
go
vamos a
around,
cerrarlo después,
and
¿ok?
then we'll
La
close it
primera
afterwards. The
pregunta
first question
tiene que ver con lo
has to do
transnacional.
with transnationalism. Miko and Monica,
Hablaron de esa
they
crítica,
spoke about this, the
hacia el
criticism
trabajo antirracista
towards
que es
anti-racial
algo
work
ajeno a
as
México,
if
y
it were
esa es
something
una
that doesn't belong in Mexico.
estrategia que
And that's a
encuentra en
strategy
América
that we
Latina,
find in all of Latin America
para alejarse del
to
tema del
sort of
racismo. Eso es
distance
centroamericano, ¿no?
oneself from
Dado eso y
this
dado el
issue of
hecho de
racism.
que
And given that,
tenemos
and the
lógicamente una
fact that we
población
have a
mexicana aquí en los
Mexican
Estados Unidos,
population
muy
here in Mexico,
grande
which is large
y muy importante
and
políticamente,
important politically,
quería saber qué
I would like to
papel
know what
ustedes ven
role
para
do
la
you
diáspora
imagine
mexicana
for
en la lucha contra
the
el
Mexican
racismo en México.
diaspora against
Y le
racism in
pregunto
Mexico. And
a
I'd
Mónica
like
y
to
a
ask
Emiko
Monica and
como
Emiko,
mexicanas
as
viviendo al
Mexicans
exterior de México,
living
y
in
también
the
a
outside of the
Juliana, que ha
country, and
colaborado
Juliana,
mucho con
who's
ellas y con
collaborated with
otras,
them and
otras instituciones.
with other
Entonces,
institutions.
y dado que el público de
And given
esta
that the
panel, me
public
imagino que
of
también
this
tenga
panel
mucha gente
also
que están
includes a lot of
situados
people
afuera de
who are
México. ¿Qué
outside of
papel
Mexico.
piensa que debe
What
jugar
role
la
should
diáspora
the
mexicana en esta
Mexican
lucha?
diaspora play in this
Tenemos
discussion
también una pregunta
or in
de
this battle? We also have a question, a struggle, not battle, but struggle from the interpreter here. And we have a question from another Juliana, who's a student of literature. She wants to know, how would you answer this idea that the costeños only saw themselves as Black when others started calling them Black, like Father Glynn from Trinidad and Tobago? How would you respond to that sort of criticism? Which is another way of asking that same question that I've just asked, like this about things coming up in from the outside. How do you deal with this sort of criticism that's always present? And the next thing that I'd like to put into the pot in the time that we have left is Homar Marval, which has to do with the role played by the state in negating racism. And we saw in Juliana and Emiko, especially,
unos ejemplos específicos en los
some
cuales
specific examples where the state has played that kind of a role. And so I'd like to know whether Monica might be able to say something about that, or if there's something that to add about this, the role of state in the denying that there's racism in Mexico. I'd like to start with Monica and then maybe Juliana and then Emiko, and just give you like 3 minutes each to answer. And I'm really sorry that we have such little time. Well, I think as in everywhere, and it's not just in the diaspora, but for Mexicans in the United States, a big challenge is, I think, to understand how racism has affected them or you. How do you hold this story of racism in Mexico? You bring the history of racism in Mexico from families and stories. It's a way that there's a way in which it travels and then arrives and sort of collapses, collapses into racism in the United States. And that is, I think, a complicated experience. And an important thing is, an important aspect is how to sort of unravel those experiences to be able to understand how it's lived I mean, the work that we do in Coopera has made us aware that there is no way to sort of make a compromise with the anti-racist position if you don't deal with your own experience. How, first of all, to understand how it affects you, and then from this place to that place, how can you think about how racism is working in your life? I mean, that's like, but it's like everybody has to deal with that. How does racism affect us? And for people who migrate, it's also a question of considering how those stories migrate, how the reference point isn't the United States, but is Mexico. It's Latin America and what's happened there, and colonization, process of mestizaje. There's a story there that's been, I mean, we've been lied to in the sense that, oh, well, then we hear, oh, no racism in Mexico, no, only in the United States. And I think that confuses our experience quite a bit. I mean, I'd suggest to begin there, to be able to afterwards sort of link up with organizations that are working. There's a lot of activity in Mexico right now. It's been increasing. Lots of activity in the networks online. You know, what's this prieto, this darkness? There's this work is being done, and there's the indigenous, from the indigenous perspective, there's mobilization, and so there are things that are going on, political, organizational, whereby you can at first just kind of find out what's going on and then be able to maybe join in some respect. Juliana.
Bueno, antes quiero responder a Nancy.
Well, first I'd like to answer Nancy about what the Padre, this is about that we recognize we were Black just when Padre Lin said something. And what I want to say is this process is much, it began in 97. There were already movements inside communities. If I talk about my community, for example, which is a reference point, at the beginning of the 90s, like say 91, 92, with Professor Israel, from the Casa del Pueblo, there was a movement that began that wanted to rescue the dance of the turtle, who gave us, who was connected to our identity, Afro Mexican identity. Lin arrived in 1997, and he got together with those groups that were already working in that area to see that he had phenotypic characteristics like those of who lived in the zone. It's like pulling from here and there people who are already working in that, and Israel was one of them, who was in this committee, who organized the first group or meeting of people. But it wasn't because he came, saw us as Black, and then, oh, we recognize as Blacks. It was a process that was already there from before. And it was kind of like the trigger for beginning a more visible process or organization. That doesn't mean that it began with that. It's a myth, kind of like the foundational myth about the boat that nobody's been able to, address and get rid of. I think that's what I would be able to answer Nancy here. I don't know if you like or not this answer, but anyway, in terms of difficulties that we face with racism, at a national level, it's very difficult to be Black, to be a Black woman in this country that obscures racism, as Monica has said. I mean, on the one hand, she says it says that we're all the same, we're all equal, it's in the law, but when you actually exercise rights, then it's different. It's kind of like, well, you're treated based on how they see you, and unfortunately, that's how it is. When I have tried to leave the country, where I've most suffered racism is institutionally, people in institutions, in customs. Since I'm not of the country, I'm not Mexican for many people, right? I'm, I don't know, Cuban, Haitian, any other place, but not Mexican. They doubt my identity. And that right that I have to be different. There's a project here, a national project that has been fomented by racism because it was supposedly we were all going to be the same, really equal, but that equality has meant disadvantages for some groups like Afro or indigenous people. And when these equalities engendered inequalities, then there's some problems, and that's what we're talking about. I don't know. I think that this is I'm now speaking like Cantinflas, but as we've battled, we've struggled against this racism, and there's a very clear example in the census. In the end, it was towards the end, it was saying that it was being said that the question wasn't going to be included in the census, that INEGI didn't have money, and so so we're going to take out this issue of the Blacks, and it hasn't been in the census, and now what difference does it make? However, those of us who were organized, especially the women who were organized with the support of some organizations by people from other parts, other countries, Race and Equality, for example, group, they work with the group that Emiko and Monica work in. They went in front of international organizations like the International Human Rights Organization and exacted that we had to be in that census, that question mustn't be removed. And that was where a lot of debates got started. And in the end, it was like, well, I mean, it stayed in the census, but there wasn't like a kind of budget to make a campaign, to create a campaign in support of the census, or, those people who have been sort of in this whitening process historically, who don't know much about their ancestors and who phenotypically look different, or who have culture or tradition that are different. It didn't have the impact that it should have had because of this racism that exists around it. And those who were applying the census had this racism also internally. And so that caused what's happened. And so it's been a series of things that have impeded our progress. And we've been trying to alleviate these things and somehow confront them. And in this case, it's been from the point of view of the law. With Dr. Loria Beldaño has been helping us in order to advance with a little bit that we have in the constitutional reform. It's like to grab onto the international umbrella, the treaties that have been signed by Mexico, to be able to raise our voice and make it legalizing some of this, to be able to accede to a full palette of rights. I don't know if these answer the questions that were formulated, but says Tiana, yes, I think so. Thank you, Juliana. Emiko, 3 minutes. Is there something else that you would like to? I think that they've answered. Is there something that you would like to?
Sí, gracias a Mónica y
Thanks,
Juliana.
Mónica and Juliana. And Emiko.
Parece que tenemos más tiempo.
¿Puedo poner algo si tengo
Can
tiempo?
I add something? If I have time, I'd like to add something about those who have been in other countries who've been trying to integrate into the Afro-Mexican struggle. Some have arrived saying, oh, well, they come and they say, well, but you're not really Black. I mean, you're very white to be Black. I want to find someone who's really, really Black. But I consider myself Black. I have the right to self-describe that way because of my tradition, because of my culture, because of my gastronomy, because of just everything. It's not just my skin color. And they say, well, for me, that's important. And others say, well, why didn't you go to a symposium, colloquium, forum? And we've asked for money to support you, since you say that you needed.
For money, for
you're saying that
support,
you
and
don't
they say
have.
they need some things.
You're saying you need things. It's
they
been
have
seen
seen it
erroneously by
the
some people,
wrong way.
but
It's like
those of us who've been
like
allies,
our allies
have been there too, and so we've had a bit of
has
everything.
been
This
seen that
process
way.
along
So
these
we've
15
seen
years,
everything.
I
We've
have
seen
seen
a
a
lot
lot,
of things in this
and
process.
the aspirations
the
is that in the
desires
future we have a
is
reform that
hoping
really
that we
concedes
have
us specific
a
rights,
reform that will give
which
us
can be translated into
rights,
a
very
better
specific
quality of
rights
life
that
for
will
men and women,
translate
but
into a
especially
quality of life for men
that
and women.
we
And first of all,
realize
that
how
that this is
racism is
that shows
impacting
us how
this
what the impact has
population,
been
and
on
to
this
start to move
population,
towards
this kind
eradicating
of
it.
racism, and we can
Thank
start
you, Juliana.
eradicating it. Thank you, Juliana.
Yes,
Thank you.
touch
It
me
really
goes
goes
deeply
to
to hear you
my
speak. It's
deepest
not
parts
always
of
that we
my
have a
heart,
voice
and
of
it's not
a
often that we have
Afro-Mexican woman who's doing grassroots
group-based
work
work
in this sort of a
in this kind of debate. We don't
debate. So
often
thank
have
you so much for your
Afro-Mexican
contributions.
women.
Thank you to
Thank you,
Monica.
Monica.
Thank you to
Thank you,
Enrico for your time,
for her time, the job, the
for
work that she's
your
done, and her
wisdom.
wisdom. Thank
Thanks
you
for being with us.
And
before we
before
end,
we
I need to
finish,
mention
I
that
want to
the
say that
Afro-Mexican
today's
Symposium today
symposium
has two
on
panels. One
Afro-Mexicans,
starts in
and
90
we have
minutes at
two
2,
panels, 90 minutes at 2 p.m.,
which is going to be
and it's
about
going to be
culture.
on culture. And
la película
and the
Beyond,
film
Beyond
Beyond
La Bamba,
and the
by Marco
filmmaker Marco
Villalobos,
Villalobos,
director,
and
we
a
have a discussion with
the
Hugo
photographer
Arellanes
Hugo Arellanes
Antonio,
Antonio. I don't
photographer.
know
And
if
I don't know if Raymond
Professor
Tejas
Raymond
would like
wants
to
to
say
say
something.
something
Very briefly,
very
I want to
simple.
thank
I want
everybody.
to thank all of you,
Diana, Juliana, Monica, and
Juliana, and
Emiko.
Emiko.
It's a pleasure to have
having you
you, and it
here.
was
It's
an
a
excellent
fabulous
panel.
panel. And
Y me gustaría
terrific panel, and Juliana and Monica and Enrico, what a delight to have you. Thank you for joining us for this panel. And I want to remind everybody that this is being recorded. This is being recorded. We will be able to access this in the future. And as Tiana mentioned, we are having a session in the afternoon on culture with a film by Marco Villalobos, and also Hugo Arellanes's photos. He's going to talk about his photos, but then actually what we're going to do is we're going to take you to his galleries, which will be accessible even after the symposium on the LRC website. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you again this afternoon. So please make sure that you have registered for the afternoon session, okay? That's very important because you registered for this morning session, but you have to do a separate registration for this afternoon. So muchísimas gracias y buenas tardes.
thank you very much, and thank you very much. And thank you, Daniel Marquez, for the job.
For your,
thank you very much that you do this job, and it's
Thank you.
invisible most of the time.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you very
See
much,
later.
and see you
Goodbye.
later.
Goodbye.